Recently, we have witnessed another sustained, brutal and unforgiving assault on the Palestinian people by Israel, in which hundreds of civilians, including 65 children, were slaughtered. The deliberate destruction of homes, media offices, libraries, police stations, a university, the only COVID test centre in Gaza, all breaches of the Geneva Convention. In other words, a war crime. But this violence did not take place in a vacuum. It was a direct consequence of 54 years of Israeli occupation and colonisation of Palestinian lands. We've brought forward this motion with the support of Trócaire, Sadatka, Christian Aid, ICTU, and a broad section of the Oireachtas, who I thank for co-signing it, the Social Democrats, the Labour Party, and numerous independents. A fundamental tenet of modern international law is legal maxim, which translates a lawbreaker cannot benefit from their illegal act. Since 1967, the international community has been unequivocally clear that the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank has broken international law and constitutes a clear crime. The Israeli program to populate Palestinian lands, otherwise known as the settler program, has been the engine that has driven annexation. It is what has turned an Israeli military occupation into a colonization of Palestinian lands. Yet, despite all the legal rulings, the international law, the 30 UN Security Council resolutions, the hundreds of resolutions that have emanated from the UN General Assembly, Israel has never been held to account for its actions. The reality is that in Palestine, the application of international law is determined by the variables of power equation. And I do not need to remind anyone of the disparity of power on this issue. It is this power asymmetry that allows Israel to pursue a policy of managing the conflict rather than seek a meaningful rapprochement with Palestinians, in order that the illegal policy of annexation be allowed to continue to the point where there no longer remains a cohesive, coherent entity that was once the Palestinian people. The EU claims to have prevented annexation from happening last summer. This is not the reality on the ground, which is the fact that de facto annexation is happening. We have the potential to change the EU position. Remarkably, if we adopt this motion here today, we will be the first European country to attempt to frame a fresh discourse around the conflict through the acknowledgement that annexation is taking place. The respected humanitarian groups, Human Rights Watch, Al-Hag and Bethlehem, have all labelled the Israeli government as an apartheid regime. And the Israeli regime, which strives to promote and perpetrate Jewish supremacy in the entire area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, is an apartheid regime. Accordingly, land is used to develop and expand existing illegal settlements and build new ones, while Palestinians are dispossessed and corralled into small, crowded enclaves, effective bandustans. I acknowledge that others have brought forward other amendments, but I believe that it is important that we act with one voice. Today is about generating unity around one specific issue, and that is annexation. And ultimately, the discourse needs to move on to what sanctions and measures need to be imposed as a consequence of the continuous breaching of international law. And I believe that it is important that we remain focused on what we can achieve here today by supporting this motion.
Today's motion reflects the grave concern of the Irish people and this Oireachtas in relation to the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And it is a clear signal of the depth of feeling across Ireland on this issue. This government shares that grave concern, both in respect of the violence and conflict that we've seen in Gaza, in the West Bank and Israel itself, and on the root causes of the situation and the manifestly unequal treatment of the Palestinian people. It's important to acknowledge that the current escalation has not happened in isolation. Today's motion addresses some of the root causes, which have been a driver of recent tensions. We cannot return to a business as usual situation. It's simply no longer an option. We cannot return to the flouting of international law with the relentless expansion of illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. We cannot return to forced evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem and other parts of the West Bank. We cannot return to demolition of Palestinian property, settler violence and intimidation. We must acknowledge that these actions, occurring at a rate unacknowledged by the international community for many years, are a source of legitimate grievance amongst the Palestinian people and undermine the prospects of peace and much-needed reconciliation. Israel's actions in increasing the scope and density of settlements and surrounding infrastructure, which effectively cuts off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, indicates an intention of permanency. Not only does it deny the Palestinian population access to land, housing and livelihoods, it undermines the viability of a future contiguous Palestinian state. This, of course, is not something that the international community can sit by and ignore. The scale, pace and strategic nature of Israel's actions on settlement expansion and the intent behind it has brought us to a point where we need to be honest about what is actually happening on the ground. And we need to call it out for what it is. It is de facto annexation. This is not something that I, or in my view, this House, says lightly. We are the first EU member state to do so, but it reflects the huge concern that we have about the intent of the actions and, of course, their impact. Ireland has been vocal in its opposition to the threatened evictions in East Jerusalem and expansion of settlements more generally, both of which have contributed to the current events and which have done damage to prospects for a two-state solution. At the UN Security Council, we have urged Israel to halt continued settlement expansion, demolition activity and evictions in East Jerusalem. I have underlined at the Council that continued settlement activity is not only illegal, but also erodes trust between Palestinians and Israelis. Returning to the status quo, as I said earlier, is no longer an option. But that will happen by default without sustained political attention to resolve the underlying problems. And without this, the cycle of violence will continue, as it has done for decades. Repressive, discriminatory and provocative policies and actions take us further away than ever from the prospect of achieving a just, lasting, comprehensive peace. Breaking the cycle of repression and hatred is integral to achieving a peace settlement. It is time to look afresh at how the international community can really assist Israelis and Palestinians to bring new thinking and a new momentum to resolving this conflict and to ensuring equitable treatment for both peoples. I hope this House will unite and support the government, along with other parties in this House, in our joint efforts. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Ceann Comhairle, I imagine there is no silence as deafening as that invoked by a ceasefire. What happens, what sound does a person hear when bombs stop being dropped, when screams are not being heard for the first time in weeks, when fighter jets are not screeching overhead, threatening the lives of people and children in a population, one of the most congested population on earth? During the horrors of the latest round of violence to be inflicted on the Palestinian people, the Irish people stood in shocked disbelief that one group of people could treat another with such barbarism, with such inhumanity. We were horrified by the death toll. As of today, 248 people in Gaza were killed from precision missiles, 66 of those killed being children. Almost 2,000 people wounded in one of the most congested places on earth. One can't help but imagine the carnage that was rained on the people of Gaza from the sky from million-pound missiles. The fighter jets of Benjamin Netanyahu bombed the bureaus of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press just last week, and the only collective response the world could agree upon was a meek call for calmness of hostilities on both sides. For this crime, there will be no sanctions. There will be no boycotts or divestments that target the pockets of the perpetrators of this crime. Today, though, through our Parliament, the Irish people get to take a stand, to give words and to give meaning of what our own eyes can clearly see. It will be significant that the Irish Parliament, through its representatives, recognises what Israel is doing in East Jerusalem and West Bank represents a de facto unlawful annexation of these territories. It is important that we do this now and to not equivocate as we do so, but to be unified in their message that Israeli actions would no longer go unchallenged, if not by the international community, then certainly by the people of Ireland who remain in horror at the barbarism we witnessed. While the world seems to turn its attention elsewhere, the people of Gaza remain under effective siege. The bulldozers are still moving into East Jerusalem, where opposition to their presence is crushed, and families in Sheikh Jarrah are still being forced from their homes. So we, as a truly modern, vibrant democracy, recognising that an annexation is being carried out by the State of Israel and the Palestinian territories, is an important act that will reverberate around the world and hopefully have some meaning for the people who are being displaced from their land. Prior to this latest assault, Israel had been engaged in the forced eviction of Palestinian families as it continues to expand its illegal settlements. There comes a time when inaction in the face of relentless human rights abuses and war crimes becomes complicity. Most importantly, this will send a message to the people of Gaza. We support you. We are with you.
It's difficult to speak on this topic without getting emotional, Minister. And so we have a ceasefire. We have a ceasefire after 248 Palestinian people lost their lives, 66 of whom were children, 39 women and 17 elderly people. And of course, I condemn the loss of life in Israel as well. The imbalance of power is absolutely palpable. And if we just look at the figures, and again, I am not comparing one death with another, and the 12 Israeli people, including 2 children and an Israeli soldier that lost their lives, must be condemned. But we cannot ignore the figures that are here and the imbalance of power. What rules govern the behaviour of Israel? What rules govern our response in relation to Israel when you look at the background in relation to Palestine? Since 2007, Israel has launched major offensives. You know what they call it, Minister? Mowing the lawn. Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Between the 8th of July and the 27th of August, 2,104 Palestinians were killed. Only one side has clearly violated international law. When Israeli acts, we call it self-defense. When the Palestinians act, we call it acts of terrorism. Now, surely, Minister, you might help to clarify language in this area. It's down on a civilian population, and we can't act together in unison with one voice to say, please, you cannot do this in our name. We who have a proud history of standing up to colonization. This is colonization by Israel. This is illegal occupation. How long more are you going to wait to protect the integrity of Palestinian territory until there's no territory left, not to mention men, women and children? At what point are you going to come into this stall and tell us now is the time to protect the integrity of the Palestinian nation and fulfil our commitment in the programme for government?
Deputy Brady to conclude.
Thanks, Count Corla. Well, we've heard the arguments and we have heard the amendments as well. And I again call on members to remain focused on the magnitude, on what we are on the cusp of actually achieving here. We will be become the first European country to formally acknowledge that the crime of annexation has taken place. The architecture of the Israeli government's strategy on the development of settlements signals the intention of making this a permanent fixture. The motion reflects the concern of the Irish people at the plight of the Palestinian people. The memory and the consequence of colonisation lives in the very marrow of our bones. It is right that with our unique understanding of the experience of colonisation, that we will be the first parliament in Europe to call out Israel on its apartheid policies. We can set in train a process that can rip the gates off the open-air prison that is the occupied Palestinian territories. And if we get this motion agreed, all who speak for this Dáil will now carry the imprimatur of the Irish people. But what next? And I'll conclude on this, Count Corley. I contend that in passing this motion, we are mandating our government to move forward to the next stage, which is to work internationally to introduce measures that will hold Israel truly to account. And I commend this motion to the Dáil, and I hope it will be fully supported by all.
Thank you.